Hey internets. Now, unless you have somehow been completely disconnected from reality for the last 5 days or so, or at least since the weekend or, the date of July 13th, and you've just hopped online today to watch this video, you are probably aware of the attempted assassination of Donald Trump that took place that day in Pennsylvania near Butler Farm Show during his rally. This is easily one of the most important events of the decade, and we can pretty safely assume that it's going to be talked about ad nauseum for quite a while. I would assume the news is probably going to keep talking about this for at least the rest of the month, and then there will probably be various takes about this for years to come, with more and more theories being stacked on top of each other on just what happened this day and how it happened, etc., etc. But for now, since it's a very recent event, naturally everyone in the media is covering it, everybody at the dinner table is talking about it, and of course the interwebs is completely losing their mind over it. And that's where this video comes in, because even with the limited information we have now, people are still posting some very stupid things that need to be refuted. A lot of copes, a lot of misinformation, a lot of just general bad takes, and that's what this video is for, is refuting some of those bad takes that we've been seeing over the last few days. Because some of the things that some people have been saying about this event are just borderline completely insane, as well as just based on total ignorance of how firearms actually work, and what certain firearms are capable of reliably doing, as well as just things that are just obviously wrong to any rational person. But anyways, I'll start off first with this bizarre conspiracy theory, mostly coming from leftists, or just general left-leaning liberals, that this was somehow staged, that Donald Trump somehow planned his own assassination event, and that he and his team were working with the shooter in order to fake the whole thing, basically as a ploy to make Donald Trump look good. Basically, that the entire thing was just a setup to get this one good shot and boost Trump's numbers. And based on the facts we currently have, this is insanely unlikely. In fact, almost impossible. This would require a shot to be taken that is just so difficult to consistently make that it implies that this dude, Thomas Matthew Crooks, that's the shooter in case anyone has again been living under a rock for the last week, that this guy is somehow skilled to the point that he puts every Olympic medal rifle competitor to shame. Because according to the best info we currently have, the shooter used a generic AR-15 and shot Trump from about 150 yards away. Now, unfortunately, that actually doesn't tell you a whole lot because there's a lot of different AR-15s. But it doesn't really matter because even on the higher end of those specs, this is still just a shot that is impossible to hit in the event of just trying to stage it. An AR-15 is generally effective at shooting a target from about 600 yards away, and again, that's at the higher end of the estimate. It is possible for this estimate to be slightly higher or much, much, much lower, depending on which specific AR-15 we are talking about, since again, it's actually more of a style of rifle that can be heavily modded and can be used with several different rounds. But for the most part, that is the rifle's capability. A skilled shooter can reliably hit a target about the size of a motorcycle from about 600 yards away using an AR-15. Now, the issue here is that the shot that Donald Trump was hit with is an earshot within 1 inch of hitting his head, in a way that, would actually kill him. In .22 LR competitions, they fire from about 50 yards at targets using rifles that have an effective range of about 100 to 300 yards, which is interesting and useful for this because this is also about 4 times the range of their target, similar to what the range of the Trump shooting was at. Again, he shot at Trump from 150 yards away using a rifle that has an effective range of about 600 yards away. And because of this, we can make a pretty fair comparison based on the performance of people competing at the Olympics. And the comparison just doesn't even come close. The answer that Trump would only have given him a few seconds to even line the shot up. So not only would this kid have to have made this shot, but he would have had to have made it in conditions that are far more volatile and difficult than just simply lining up and shooting at targets indoors. Even finding someone who can hit this shot 50% of the time would be hard enough. Finding someone who can do it 100% of the time, which would be necessary to stage it, impossible. A person that good does not exist. So again, to say that this is staged, you're implying that this random nobody dude is just the hidden god king of rifles and has supernatural powers to ensure the gun always fires straight perfectly every single time, which, by the way, rifles don't do that. And what's even weirder is that the AR-15 isn't even the best choice. If you wanted to stage this event, you would first of all have Trump stand in this position for much, much longer. And second of all, there are rifles out there that have a much longer effective range in terms of accuracy than an AR-15. There are rifles out there with 1,000 to 2,000 yards of effective range for accuracy rating. Why on earth would Trump risk his life staging his own assassination attempt and not even using a rifle that's good for the job? This is an absolutely crazy risk for Trump to take. No, the reason people often choose AR-15s for this kind of job is because it's easy. The AR-15 is often used by shooters because it is based off the M16 and is a reliable semi-automatic rifle for taking a target down, because the rate of fire for an AR-15 is much higher than most of those guns with a 1,000 to 2,000 yard range. And this is a problem for the "it was staged" narrative, because the fact that the shooter used an AR-15 is proof that the shooter is actually not that skilled. He was going for quantity of shot at a general direction of Trump rather than a quality one single shot. Or to put it in simpler terms, the shooter used a spray and pray tactic, which explains why some people in Trump's audience got hit. So Trump would have to be completely out of his mind to try and stage this attack on himself using this equipment in this specific scenario. Even if we assume that Crooks is the best shooter in the entire world and puts every Olympic shooter for the last 100 years to shame, you wouldn't do it this way. You would not set up the shot this way. You would not try this way. This kind of theory only makes sense if you're one of those people who just doesn't know anything about what an AR-15 can do, and you're one of those people who just thinks that the AR-15 is some super scary god weapon that always does what you want it to do, which is absolutely not the case. What I think is most likely going on here with this theory is that there's people suffering from TDS spinning up the rationalization hamster. Their Trump derangement syndrome is so bad they can't possibly imagine Trump actually facing a serious threat of death and not being a coward. So instead of seeing this event and asking themselves, maybe he's not that much of a coward, maybe I was slightly wrong about this guy, they are instead just out of knee-jerk emotional reaction, assuming it must have been staged without really thinking too hard about it or considering the facts. I don't think these people actually have any idea how it could have been staged. They're just saying it was staged out of just kind of an emotional reaction. I don't think it's based on any kind of rational analysis of how the events took place. So I'll just move on to the next thing, which is more of a cope than anything, which is this idea that Crooks was in fact a Republican, and therefore it's some kind of Trump infighting, and therefore none of the rhetoric coming from the Biden camp can be seen as something that contributed to the reasons behind why this shooting took place. It's basically just a cope to avoid any kind of responsibility, because one take out there that is largely correct is that there's a very good chance that the reason behind this event and the reason why Trump had this assassination attempt on him is an example of stochastic terrorism, by Trump's opponents constantly saying that he is an existential threat to everyone's way of life, and that Trump is going to end democracy and end America, and that he therefore must be stopped by any means necessary. And that is stochastic terrorism. When a demagogue says things like this, they are implying that it is entirely justified for somebody, anybody, to fix the situation using violence. And for years now, I've been watching Democrats drastically overestimate and drastically exaggerate the threat of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, by an actual realistic and serious measure of what he actually does, is more like a bizarre mixture of Reaganism and 1990s Democrats. The actual policies that Donald Trump goes with and what he actually does when he's in power are things that would be considered politically moderate about 50 years ago or so. The whole Drumpf is literally bad evil mustache man is really just nothing more than fear-mongering coming from Dems from the last decade or so. And that's where the whole he was a Republican cope is coming from. It's just a way to avoid responsibility. If you think about it for longer than 10 seconds, it makes a lot more sense to assume that the reason he's a registered Republican is simply so he could vote against Donald Trump in the primaries. Which, by the way, is a very standard tactic that a lot of voters take. It doesn't actually cost you anything to do, and it doesn't actually force you to have to vote Republican in the actual election, which I think, just based on the fact that the guy tried to kill Donald Trump, we can pretty safely say that he was not planning on voting for Trump. Now, on the flip side, he did donate to Act Blue, which is a progressive, left-leaning organization which actually does cost him money. Now, admittedly, there's not much information that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt what this guy's political beliefs are, or were, I should say, since he's passed away, as he was shot by Secret Service during the event. But you could pretty safely say that he's probably not a right-winger just by thinking rationally about the incentives. If you are someone who does not like Donald Trump and you do not want Donald Trump to win, which we can again safely say based on Crook's actions, you absolutely have something to gain by registering as a Republican, because it allows you to vote against him in any potential primary. And again, you don't really lose anything since you're not forced to vote for him if he does win the primary in the main election. Giving money to Act Blue, admittedly, even though he didn't give very much, on the other hand, there's no real reason to do this from any rational perspective, unless you actually believe in the principles of Act Blue. There's no benefit whatsoever that a Republican would gain by donating to Act Blue. There's no rational reason to do this considering his incentive drives. But overall, it doesn't really look like voting is really a big deal to this guy, because the records show currently that he only voted in the 2022 midterm election. It's possible he just didn't bother to vote in Trump's primary, simply because he saw no point, as it was very, very likely that Trump was going to win anyway. There wasn't any real serious competition. The point here is he doesn't really have much to lose by being a registered Republican, but he does have something to gain, whereas actually donating his own money, well, obviously he does have something to lose there. The only possibility where I am wrong here is if Crooks is some kind of deranged accelerationist. And the problem with that is that accelerationists get their ideas from this belief that the divide in the West cannot actually be resolved, which means that divisive rhetoric coming from the left about how Trump is literally bad mustache man would still apply here, as it still contributes to the accelerationist mindset. It's also just extremely unlikely this would be the first time in history that an accelerationist took things this far. Which means this whole cope that he was somehow a right-winger is kind of one of those things that comes across to me as straw grasping, which is an intellectually dishonest form of reasoning where people look at unknowns in an event and then they grasp on to the less likely thing to be true, because even though it's less likely to be true, it's somehow ideologically beneficial to them to believe it. In other words, lefties are just coping by sticking to something about the shooter that is very unlikely to be true, so they can avoid having a step back and taking some kind of personal responsibility that maybe, just maybe, their rhetoric contributed to this event. Overall, the people who are making this argument come across to me as just completely unserious. People who are not willing to use Occam's razor and are instead just going with whatever set of facts are beneficial to them are not really people you should be listening to. Now, as for me personally, I suspect that the most likely scenario is that this kid was a whack job. He was probably one of those unstable people who jump between right and left extremes on the political spectrum. I say this just based on the fact that this is what often is the case with people who are insane enough to go along with what this guy did. But one thing we can say for certain is that at the moment he was trying to shoot and kill Donald Trump, he probably didn't like Donald Trump. So this idea that he was a Republican, or even in some cases people saying that he was a Trump supporter, it just kind of goes hand in hand with the previous problem of people trying to say that it was staged. Which again, for reasons I already talked about, for the reasons for why it was not staged, is a very, very insane take, which requires the people believing it to either A, not know anything about rifles, or B, you have to believe that Crooks somehow has these supernatural shooting abilities. Again, extremely unlikely to be true. Anybody professing these things comes across as completely unserious at absolute best. So anyway, I'll move on to the next bad take, which is this from Hasanabi. I'll just roll a clip from him here and let him speak for himself.
Knew him as a child who was a former member of the varsity rifle team, said, quote, he was a nice kid who never talked poorly of anyone, and I have never thought him capable of anything I've seen him do in the last few days.
Bro, that's how you know this motherfucker was white, by the way. White as hell. This dude shot at the president, the former president. That is how you know he was white. Like, I'm talking not even like a little Italian white. That's how you know. Bro, if this dude was even like a little bit Latino, if he had like one family member from Spain or some shit, they would be like, undocumented migrants, man. You know how they are. He was white, bro. They're calling him a kid. They're saying he was a nice kid. Whoo! He was so goddamn white, dude. Holy.
Now, I've already made a pretty long video showcasing how Hasanabi is, to put it as nicely as I possibly can, not the brightest online political influencer. He's not the smartest guy, and to his credit, to some degree, he knows he's not the smartest guy. But the reason this needs to be called out is because it's an example of just how toxic and stupid Hassan's race baiting can get. This idea that the reason CBS is going easy on this kid is just because he is super white, or whatever, is pretty demonstrably not true. First off, the anchor was just reading a statement from somebody else. Second of all, CBS has a pretty well-documented center-left bias, which actually comes with a slight anti-white bias. So CBS is definitely not a publication that is going to be treating people with kid gloves just because they are white. But third of all, another really obvious reason that they're probably not being as harsh on him is really just standard operating procedure in terms of code of behavior, because Thomas Matthew Crooks was shot and killed during the incident. News anchors generally don't call for blood against a person who is already dead. This is just standard professionalism and behavioral standards. You don't speak as much ill against someone who has passed away. Also, it's just basic common sense. You can't hold Crooks responsible any further than he's already been held responsible, because he's gone. He's passed away. It's actually kind of weird that Hasanabi doesn't seem to understand this, or if he does understand it, he just doesn't care or think about it in this moment. This is one of the few standards of professional behavior that most of the media still abides by. The language and word choice used against a perpetrator who has passed away is intentionally more lenient than language used against one that is still alive. This is a far more likely explanation explanation for CBS's word choice than him just being white. Now, whether this is Hasanabi trying to exploit racism for clicks and clout and whatnot, or if this is just another case of him letting white people live inside his head rent-free, or perhaps a little of both, I honestly don't really care since both are equally idiotic. And that's the real problem with Hasanabi's rhetoric here. Aside from just being based on things that are factually inaccurate and demonstrably nonsensical, it's just really irresponsible. It makes very little sense to take Trump's assassination attempt and turn it into a weird race thing. And I actually hadn't even seen anybody have this take until I saw this clip from Hasanabi. And while it is admittedly pretty easy to explain why this take from him doesn't actually make any sense, I'm pretty sure most of the people who watch my videos regularly can watch this from Hasanabi and realize why what he's saying is incorrect. I still figured it would be important to include it because this kind of race-baiting rhetoric needs to get called out a lot more often. Leftoids like Hassan get away with saying crap like this way more than they should. It does not help race relations at all for a person with this level of influence to be seething over white people 24/7. Anyways, speaking of political influencers with some level of fame, next up I unfortunately have to address the Destiny question. If there has ever been an example of what terminal TDS looks like, where a person is willing to completely destroy their career over their extreme level of TDS, then I'd imagine that everything that Destiny has posted since the Trump assassination attempt would stand as a pretty good example of this level of total, complete self-meltdown. I could, if I wanted to, make this entire video about all of the things he has posted, but I am not going to. For one, there's a really good chance that Destiny doesn't actually believe some of the crazy things that he is saying, and is just intentionally posting edgy stuff for clout, because that's unfortunately how the X algorithm works. X/Twitter or whatever kind of incentivizes people who are just trying to get as many followers as possible to sort of intentionally post rage bait comments in order to farm the algorithm for engagement. So it's kind of up in air to what degree he really believes these things. So I'm just going to focus on two of his tweets. The first is this one right here. Oh, suddenly conservatives have an appetite for cancel culture? Crazy, I thought they were just words. In response to, what Destiny is doing is clearly against X rules by his glorifying violence. And it is then immediately followed by this wonderful tweet right here, where he is justifying and making fun of the guy who got shot at the Trump rally. You see, the problem with cancel culture is that the way it currently works is that big tech companies censor people based on various political affiliations, as well as San Francisco politics and sensibilities. However, in terms of the way that freedom of association works, it actually does make perfect sense for a private platform to demonetize people who are actually glorifying violence, because that is an actual call for real property rights violations. It makes absolute perfect sense for private platforms to ban people who are calling for others' rights to be violated. The only issue with cancel culture is that big tech cancels people who are actually calling for rights to not be violated. That is the problem with cancel culture, is that the people who are currently in charge of it are usually prestige-seeking cathedralites who care more about censoring specific political opinions based on terrible subjective reasoning. That's why you see weird situations like, for example, Facebook, where Facebook puts greater effort into censoring people's political opinions that disagree with San Francisco sensibilities again, rather than effort that they put forth towards getting rid of scammers who are trying to steal people's money. So you have this really stupid situation where Facebook's moderation team is running around censoring random conservative boomers over these random boomer memes. Meanwhile, Facebook has all these hundreds of thousands of scam accounts that they're not doing anything about. It's really dumb. It's why I don't really use Facebook at all. Anyways, the point I'm making here is there's nothing actually wrong with wanting to not monetize violent content. The problem with cancel culture is that the people who are currently in charge of it are people who care about stupid things that don't matter and have nothing to do with people's rights. If you're using a private platform to call for violence and bloodshed against millions of people that you happen to disagree with, and then you get butthurt when that platform doesn't want to monetize your content, I'm sorry, but Destiny, if you end up watching this video, seek psychiatric help immediately. I'm not joking. I'm not even trying to insult you. I am dead serious, bro. Get help. That is, of course, assuming that you actually stand by this take 100% and aren't just Twitter engagement farming via intentional rage bait. And just to be perfectly honest with everybody here, that's probably what Destiny's actually doing. He's just rage posting for attention and clout, because Twitter's algorithm unfortunately currently incentivizes them. Anyways, the last thing I want to look at here is something that some Republicans and general conservatives and some libertarians have been posting, which is the claim that the Trump assassination attempt was an inside job. You can kind of think of this as the reverse of saying that it was staged. Instead of saying that Trump faked the assassination attempt and it was all staged and he was never actually in any real danger, this side is saying that it was actually the Secret Service who was trying to assassinate Trump, or that they were in on the plot somehow. somehow. This is kind of the standard rightoid conspiracy theory that's floating around right now, as opposed to it was staged, which is kind of the standard leftoid conspiracy theory floating around right now. However, that's not to say that these are equal. Unlike the leftoid conspiracy theory, the rightoid conspiracy that it may have been an inside job actually does have a chance of being somewhat correct. The problem is we just currently don't have enough information, and so people are just kind of going off the rails with the limited information we do have, making up takes and making up things to fill in the gaps. And this is resulting in a lot of gaps in this theory that could easily later be used to discredit it. So here's a look at the facts that we do know. If we use Google Maps to look around the area where the Trump shooting took place, we do see these set of buildings right here. And this is the location that Crooks took his shot from. Now, yes, it is entirely true that anybody familiar with shooting guns, anybody who has rifle range experience, we can look at this and know that this is really weird that this particular area was not secured. More so than any of the buildings and structures around this area, this complex at AGR International has plenty of nooks and crannies to get into and try and hide in, and plenty of good vantage points that a shooter who would be trying to make an attempt on Trump's life at this event would definitely want to get to. And yet the Secret Service didn't put anybody on the rooftops looking out around here. And that is sus. That is very, very sus. The only other possible explanation for this is just extreme incompetence. Because at the very least, you'd want to put a lookout on top of one of these buildings here. Because anybody with any experience shooting rifles knows that this area is pretty much prime real estate if you wanted to get a shot at Trump during this event. And what's even weirder is the reason that the Secret Service chief gave for why this roof was left unmanned. Because it was apparently a sloped roof and thus too dangerous, and they didn't want anybody standing up there due to safety concerns. Which on its face might seem reasonable, but the problem is if you just look at Google Maps and look at AGR International, you can pretty clearly see that these rooftops are actually not that sloped at all. In fact, the buildings that they did have snipers on were sloped at an even sharper angle. So not only did they leave an area that would be, again, prime real estate for any would-be assassin to try and get a hit on Trump, completely open and totally unguarded from the top, but the reason that they gave for doing so is just demonstrably idiotic. Now, does this prove that it was an inside job? Well, not for 100%. Not really. But it is sus. It is very, very sus. And that's why what should actually be done is that a third-party investigation from a private team should take place. Keyword emphasis being on it being an external, private third party that does the investigation. Not some bogus investigation where Biden sends in his team to do an internal investigation into the Secret Service and then finds that they did nothing wrong. Because at the very absolute least, there is a degree of incompetence here which shows that somebody probably deserves to lose their job. However, the problem I'm noticing is that some people are just coming up with these wild theories based on information that we just do not have. For instance, I saw this image alleging that the shooter was just a patsy and it was actually the police or the Secret Service who were shooting at Trump from these various sniper nests. We just don't have enough information to make that kind of conclusive call. It's really annoying when people pretend to have this secret knowledge before any kind of investigation at all has been taken place. And the only thing that takes like these actually do is they just give ammunition to bad actors in the mainstream media to then try and paint it so that anybody who has any suspicion over this event must be the same people as those who have these kind of conspiracies. It just gives the establishment media an easy straw man to attack. The smarter thing that people should be doing is instead, again, just calling for that third-party external investigation and then waiting until we have actual information and real facts to go by, as opposed to just randomly making stuff up. Again, it is sus. I will admit, it is very, very sus, but we don't actually have enough information to know for sure yet. And that's kind of the point I'm trying to make here. This was an absolutely huge, game-changing event, and assuming human civilization doesn't collapse anytime soon, historians will probably still be talking about this event on this day 1,000 years into the future. However, for now, it is still a relatively recent event, which means we don't really have all the information because no such investigation has taken place, and so the smart move is to be skeptical of these kind of takes until we have more data to go by. Anyways, that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like and subscribe and whatnot, or just leave a comment for the algorithm. And if you want to support me, you can do so on either a Ko-Fi donation or through Subscribestar, or by buying some sweet merch. That's all. Till next time.